Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about two different models of teaching, a knowledge-based model and an inquiry-based model. Now this terminology is coming from Catherine Gottschalk and Keith Shortshock's The Elements of Teaching Writing. Now, in terms of setting the stakes here, what they write is, when they've finished teaching an undergraduate class, however, scholars who are most engaged in inquiry in their fields often ask, are there any questions? With the sense that if they have done a good job of teaching, there won't be any questions left unanswered. Their students, in turn, feel that unanswered questions represent weakness or ignorance rather than occasions for further inquiry. Here's the underlying pattern. While college teachers think of scholarship as inquiry or experimentation, they often think of teaching as conveying knowledge. And while scholars think of learning as exploration, discovery, and debate, they often lead their students to believe that learning is knowing, having the right information, ideas, and methods. So, basically, what Gottschalk and Shortshock suggest is that there are two broad approaches to teaching, one of which, traditionally called the sage on the stage model, involves the idea that as an instructor, my job is to convey knowledge that I have into students' heads. I have to jam that knowledge in there, whether they like it or not. The sage on the stage model has been very, very thoroughly critiqued, very justifiably critiqued. There are a lot of problems with the sage on the stage model. One is just the power dynamics it creates within a classroom, the instructor as experts, students as novices, the idea that I, the instructor, have a corner on knowledge. I'm the only one in the room who is in a position to legitimately give or create or explore knowledge. This is incredibly disempowering to students. There are also issues with lecture-based courses just in terms of how people actually learn and retain information. It's not necessarily a very effective approach. That being said, there are a lot of contexts in which a lecture-based course or a knowledge-based model actually is often appropriate. Content-based courses, for instance, are very often going to lend themselves much more to a sage on the stage type model. History classes, for instance, there definitely should be interactive, engaging components of a history class, but a lot of what history classes need to do is to give students information. You need to learn, if you're in a history class, you need to learn that content, the content of that historical period or time frame or whatever it is. By contrast, there are skills-based courses, like the composition courses that I teach, first-year writing classes, business writing, writing for the social sciences, things like this. In these classes, it doesn't make as much sense to have a heavy lecture component. Yes, there are things that students need to learn. There is content that they need to learn, like when we talk about the three rhetorical appeals, ethos, pathos, and logos. When we talk about rhetorical methods of development, etc., these are concepts that students should learn. But it doesn't necessarily follow that I'm the only one in the room capable of generating that knowledge. Now, one other important thing I do want to say, one other benefit of the lecture-based model, the sage on the stage model, is that this is a way of demonstrating for students how scholarly arguments are put together. Presumably, your lecture will function along similar lines to how scholarship in the discipline functions. That's the ideal. It doesn't always happen that way, obviously, but that's the ideal. The goal is you will model for students in your lectures the way that scholars actually make arguments in this discipline. And that can be really, really strengthened if you draw students' attention to that. So rather than just getting up and reading a scholarly article, essentially, for the 50 minutes or the 75 minutes or whatever it is, and depending on students to see how that functioned, you can meta-analyze the lecture that you're giving. This is how I'm making this argument. This is how I'm drawing these connections. This is what scholars do. And you can even create some of that uncertainty that we get from the inquiry-based model within the knowledge-based model if you present debates within the discipline. So that breaks down that sage on the stage model, which is really premised on I am the authority, what I am telling you is true. If you say, look, this is the way that I look at X subject, but here are some other major voices in the discipline and they look at it differently. That can create moments for inquiry by your students as they start to process, okay, how are there ways that these two views could fit together? For instance, as a scholar, I often draw on Foucault and on psychoanalytic literary criticism. Now, they typically don't play well together because Foucault was very much a critic of psychoanalysis. But are there ways of doing it? That's a legitimate inquiry that students might want to pursue. So this is a way you can take that knowledge-based model and still build an inquiry component into it. Now, as far as the inquiry approach, this idea, the way that Gottschalk and Hirschalk explain it, we can view teaching as an opportunity to engage students in the kinds of inquiry and thus in the kinds of thinking and learning we pursue. Now, again, one way you can do that, even with a lecture-based model, is by presenting multiple perspectives on an issue with an honest assessment of their strengths and weaknesses. You can also encourage students to actually participate in the production of knowledge. Now, that may take a couple of different forms. One, which we very often do in, say, first-year composition courses and things like this, involves things like group work, like class discussions, full participation by all of the students, maybe. So let's read a text and critically analyze it together. The students help to generate that knowledge by asking critical questions of that text. So that's one way of engaging students in knowledge. Another way is by assigning research projects and trying to guide your students as much as humanly possible away from the I believe X, so I'm going to research to find evidence to prove X model. Instead, trying to guide them down the path of, here's an interesting question. What are the best ways of gathering evidence to answer that? So right now, for instance, I'm teaching 2 sections of a class called Writing for the Social Sciences. And the entire semester is one long research project where they're going to establish a topic, they're going to hypothesize about it, they're going to pursue scholarly research about it, they're going to do field work on that question, and they're going to make their own argument. The idea behind this is precisely that they are generating new knowledge. So by engaging in the actual methodology that social science researchers use, these students are not only learning those processes, not only learning how to do a lit review, how to design a reliable, feasible study, etc., they are also actively participating in the production of knowledge within that discipline. So that's another really, really good way. If you can get students using the projects that they are assigned to create in a productive way to generate knowledge, even if it ends up being knowledge that already exists. If it's new knowledge for them, that can be extraordinarily useful because they're learning not just that content, but they're learning ways of thinking as a scholar.